You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 100. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Pamela Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here, and I'm so delighted that you are joining me here today to celebrate this milestone episode, number 100. Can you believe it? In celebration of this milestone, I have invited a most spectacular guest. Her name is Pamela Price. She is a school teacher turned screenplay writer. And yes, she is also my mother. She is amazing. And I think you will absolutely love hearing from her. We are going to do a deep dive into screenplay writing. And we're going to talk about the parallels between screenplay writing and the evolution of your career. As you listen to our episode, I would encourage you to watch for the following 4 themes. Number 1 is the idea of story and how important it is, not just for screenplays, but also for the narrative that is unfolding within your career. Stories shape the way that we see the world. They're a very powerful tool. And at any given moment, as you are effectively writing chapter after chapter of your career, you are in control of the narrative. You are the heroine in your own story. And so I invite you to think about how it is that you are writing the story of your career. Another way that stories are relevant to your career are the stories that you tell in a job interview or similar setting where you are trying to make a point. You are trying to illustrate something. And of course, the mechanism of story is a very effective way for you to do that. So that's the first thing that I'd invite you to look for. The second thing that I would invite you to listen for is the distinct approaches that you can take when it comes to writing the story. And my mom will give 2 different examples of ways that you can approach screenplay writing. I'm not going to spoil the surprise. I'm going to let you hear that and learn that for yourself. And as you see the tension between the 2 different approaches, I'd invite you to consider how those apply and play out in the way that your professional development is unfolding. So that's the second, is what is the process that you're using to write your story? The third element I'd invite you to consider is the role of conflict in storytelling. As you know, a story where you have a perfect character who has a perfect life, they wake up, there are no conflicts, everything goes exactly according to plan, makes a story that is about as compelling as watching paint dry. And I would offer that the same is true in your career. A certain amount of conflict is what makes your career and your life more engaging. So we have a discussion about conflict and how it's used in telling stories. And I would invite you to think about how the conflicts that show up in your practice, that show up in your life, are the ideal conflicts for you, what they are trying to teach you, and who you need to become to overcome those conflicts. And fourth and finally, as you listen to today's episode, I'd invite you to think about the role of character development. And we talk about the distinction between a need and a want as it relates to storytelling. You might also consider this in terms of internal versus external problems. And as we talk about that, I'd invite you to think about where in your practice you might have a want and what need that want is really fulfilling. That will become more apparent to you as the discussion unfolds. But these are 4 different frameworks that I would offer to help you draw the parallels between writing the screenplay and writing the story of your career. So with that being said, I am going to turn over today's episode to my interview with the amazing and wonderful Pamela Price. Thank you again for joining us here today. I think you're going to love this episode, and I'm so excited to continue this journey with you, to continue these podcast episodes, and very much look forward to reconnecting with you again next week. See you soon. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here. And can you believe we are at episode 100? 100 episodes. And for this 100th episode, this very special occasion, I was lucky enough to have a very special guest come and join me here today. And that guest is Pamela Price, or Pam Price, and she is, yes, my mother. And I'm so excited to have her here today. We have had so many conversations about pretty much everything, as you might imagine. A mother and a daughter will talk about all of the things. And what has been really fun is, as I've been going down this coaching path and recording this podcast for all of you, she has been going down a parallel track, and she's going to be sharing more about that during today's episode. She once upon a time was a Montessori school teacher. She's now retired. She'll tell you again a bit more about that. And now she has a number of very creative hobbies, including screenplay writing. And in our conversations that we've had about the screenplays that she's writing, we have had these really fascinating discussions where she's talking about the elements of plot, or she's talking about character development, or she's talking about the way that she's writing her screenplays. And so many times I think to myself, this is so relevant to the work that I'm doing with the lawyers that I'm working with. And I just wanted to share some of what she is sharing with me with all of you. So it is going to be such a fun conversation. We're going to talk about screenplay writing and how screenplay writing is highly relevant to each of us in the way that we are effectively scripting our own lives. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my very, very special guest, Pam Price. Hello, Pam. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you very much, Paula. This is really fun. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I'm so glad that you're here. Now, for the benefit of our guests who don't have the pleasure of being able to speak with you on a regular basis, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Okay. Well, as Paula said, I'm a retired school teacher, and I've got two very strong hobbies. One is dancing, which I love to do. And also lately I've been doing screenwriting. So in terms of screenwriting, I'm writing what's called genre screenplays and TV pilots. So genre is generally your more commonly known films in the area of, say, comedy, horror, sci-fi, thriller, mystery. And those are the ones that I'm interested in. I'm doing comedy, horror, sci-fi, thriller, mystery. And I've also done some scripts to do with children's animation. So what I also do include in my screenplays, which is a little different, is that another one of my hobbies is guitar playing and also composing songs. And I've made them into animation style music videos. So my general idea was to take the music videos and embed them in the screenplays. So in a sense, they're also musicals. So they're genre musicals. So
fabulous. And it's been so fun watching my mom go on this journey, because it seems to have started a few years back. We were meeting for brunch one day, and she told me about a screenplay writing course that she was taking at, I believe, was it Emily Carr Vancouver Film School? Which one was it?
Yes, Vancouver Film School.
Vancouver Film School. And so she started telling me about how she'd been writing this screenplay. I think this was The Baby Boomers Can't Dance. Is that
yes,
when,
that was the
when you
first
first came out with that one? And that we had real live actors enacting the scene and singing the songs. And so it's been quite an interesting journey for me to watch as you've been writing the screenplays, writing the songs, and receiving what you have referred to as these laurels. So for anybody who's not familiar with screenplays, I wasn't before, my mom got into them, but these are awards that you get for submitting your screenplay to different contests. And so every week or two, it's like being at the Academy Awards. There's another award for a different screenplay. And so it's been such a neat experience watching you go through the process of learning how to write screenplays, doing these different genres, weaving in the music component. Now, not only am I bringing my mom on the podcast, but my mom has also brought various family members into her productions as well. So watch out. you might get brought into one of these productions. But it's been fascinating. So if you look at screenplay writing, I would love to know, for the benefit of our listeners, what it was about screenplay writing that drew you in. How would you go from teaching Montessori to all of a sudden writing screenplays?
Well, actually, what we have with education, and it's a really nice thing, we have professional development. So one time they offered a visit to Vancouver Film School, which was a sort of an unusual option to give to teachers. So another woman from the school, myself, decided, well, what the heck? Let's try that instead of attending something on teaching reading, which was, basically was more to do with my job. It was kind of a fun thing to go to something a little different. So we did go to Vancouver Film School, and I was so impressed. We got to go into a green room. We got to see how films were made. My friend actually ended up acting in a short film that very day because they did a live performance. The whole experience made me think, well, during the summer, when I have a bit of time off, I think I'll just take some part-time courses at Vancouver Film School, which I did, which led to everything from, I started with screenwriting, and at the end of it, I was learning how to make fake tattoos and do theatrical makeup. And I did a little bit of acting myself. I learned about lighting. I learned about props. It was even video rendering. I learned very simple video rendering. So it was a very fun thing.
I love this. And my kids always love going to your house, and because you have so many props in the house. Yes. And for the benefit of those who are listening, you don't have the pleasure of seeing my mother in her element, but behind her I can see they're like styrofoam heads. And they're decorated. One's wearing a hat with a mustache. The other one I can't really see. But all these props for creating the images and the makeup and the creation of the characters that ultimately end up in your various productions. So I love that there is this parallel between writing a screenplay, writing a story, and what's actually playing out in real life. And what I'd love for you to share is some of the elements that make up a screenplay. So what are some of the components that you would see in a typical story?
Well, down to its most basic form, and it's been this way for centuries, basically you have Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. And that could simply be put as beginning, middle, and end. And then more specifically, when you write the screenplay itself, the writing of the screenplay, it's formatted differently from a novel, brought down to its very basic form. You have the dialogue section, and you also have what's called the action section. And the action section is just everything you would see on the screen itself. And the dialogue section is what the characters are actually saying to one another. And there's a little more to it than that, but broken down to its simplest form. And so what you want to start with your screenplay is a really captivating beginning. That's super important. And then, of course, at the end, you want a great ending because you want the audience to remember what they've seen and go away, remember the screenplay. Yes.
Beautiful. And I have a question about that initial scene, but before we go there, what is the story arc? Like, you've got your first act, second act, third act. What is the purpose of each of those?
Well, at the first act, you see the main character in a certain situation. Then you have what's called the inciting incident, like something happens in that character's life that sends them in a different direction. So that's the arc. And then at the end of the screenplay, you see them in a somewhat different situation. And the idea is you watch the character change as they move through the storyline.
Beautiful. And I really love this story, or this idea of is it the inciting event? Is that what it's called?
Well, the inciting incident, yeah.
The inciting incident, because I did a podcast episode a couple of weeks back where we talked about transitions, lawyer transitions. And I was thinking about it in the sense of a career transition, but you can think about it for all sorts of different types of transitions. And I referred to a change cycle model that was developed by a life coach named Martha Beck. And she has 4 phases to her cycle. The first being death and rebirth, the second being dreaming and scheming, the third being the hero's journey, and then finally you end up in the promised land. And what she says is that it's all brought forth by a catalyzing event. And usually it's some sort of a catastrophe or it's an opportunity. It really just depends. Mm-hmm. And so what I thought was so interesting was that the screenplay format is similar in that you have this act 1 where you're setting things up and you've got your person or your people and they're all kind of running along business as usual. Maybe they've got their goal, who knows? But then there's this event, this inciting event that seems to throw everything off, right? It presents the challenge. It forms the basis of the story. And what I love is that in real life, we have these inciting incidents happen and they trigger these chains of events in our own lives. And so I love the idea of looking at it from the fiction standpoint, but also to think about in our own lives when we've had these events happen to us and what stories have emerged from those events. So when it comes to the inciting event, so you've got your 3 acts, you're ready, you're set up, you need characters. And so what is it that you think about when you're creating a character in one of your screenplays? What are you thinking about for that person or those people that you're inventing?
Well, I think it's interesting that the person that you referred to, I'm sorry, I forgot.
Martha Beck.
Yes, Martha Beck uses the term, I think, in the third section of her 4-part presentation of the hero's journey, because it's the same terminology we use in screenwriting, the hero's journey. And so the idea is that the inciting incident happens, and then the hero of the story, who in this case, when you're talking about a real life incident, that's you're the hero of your own story. This incident happens to you. And how do you start at the beginning? And are you a different person at the end? So in terms of screenwriting, I think to myself, okay, my hero of the story, who is a character that I make up, how does that person start off at the beginning of the story? What happens to that person to change the direction of their life? And how do they end up at the end? So how do they change? And that is their character arc, how they change.
And so how do you go about doing that? You're sitting down, you have your fictional person that you've created. How do you decide what direction they're going to go in?
There's 2 types of stories in general. Very basic drama is divided into 2 types. One is a comedy, and then one is a tragedy. And that's from Shakespeare's time. Shakespeare has his comedies and his tragedies. And very, very generally speaking, because there's lots of other things that go into it, a comedy has a happy ending, and a tragedy has a sad ending. So the first thing you've got to decide for yourself is, with the character that I'm going to create, do I want it to be a happy ending or a sad ending? And there's value to both. But generally speaking, with my characters that I create, I want to see, in a sense, the Shakespearean concept of comedy. I want to see this person go through some incident, be changed in some way, go through an arc, and end up better at the end. So therefore, I like the comedy ending, the happy ending, that feel-good ending that makes you think, yay, somebody succeeded, totally. Despite the incident.
Absolutely. And I think that's when I think about the parallels between, again, screenplay writing and working with clients in a coaching capacity. So much of it is that hopefully we're creating a comedy. Hopefully we're creating a story where the person at the beginning overcomes the obstacles and ends up having some sort of a transformation, as you've described, right? A shift in character where they are better off at the end than they are when they first started. I think there's real value too in thinking about how, if you are to take a step back and look at stories from being either in the drama category or in the tragedy category, that they're both out there. And so even though we might be out there proactively trying to script our lives as comedies, sometimes somebody else is going to take the pen, and we end up in what could be referred to as a tragedy, where we don't get the outcome that we seek. And as you pointed out, there's value in those situations too. There's value in those character arcs as well. So I think it's just really interesting for us to be able to look at stories and how stories are written, and to think about how we can take what we know about fiction and apply that to have more control or more creativity almost over how we're choosing to script our own experiences of our lives, whether it's in our career, whether it's in our families, whether it's some other element of what we're doing. So you mentioned a minute ago this concept of the hero's journey. So this is the character has the inciting event or the inciting incident. They're thrown into this challenge. And typically at the heart of a story is a conflict. Yes. And I would love to hear from you what role conflict plays in the development of your characters.
Well, there's different types of conflict that you can run up against. In terms of conflict, it could be another character in the story. Somebody else is trying to prevent you from doing what you want to do. So that can provide conflict. Or also physical situations. For example, you might want to move somewhere, but then something happens, you miss a plane, you go somewhere, you miss a plane, or for some reason you can't get to the physical place you want to get to in order to continue the journey that you have planned for yourself. And there's also your own physical being. Say, for example, you want to run a marathon and then you break your leg. That could be a physical in a sense, not necessarily a conflict per se, but something that's stopping you from achieving your goal. So that's how conflict would come into it. Either conflicting, something is stopping you from reaching your goal.
And what do you think is the importance of having conflict in a story?
It actually does make the audience more empathetic towards the character. Like if you see a show and the character doesn't have any problems, like they have something that they want, and then they just go along very nicely and get it. For whatever reason, we don't admire that kind of, as an audience, we don't tend to admire that hero from that story so much as we do somebody who has to really fight for what they want or they desire, and they have to overcome obstacles. That's part of developing empathy with your audience, to see them go through that. And you cheer them on even more when you realize that they've had to fight through a lot of things to get to their goal, as opposed to just simply getting it really easily. And I don't know, something to do with human nature makes us feel that way. I'm not sure what.
It's so interesting. I was doing a little pre-reading in anticipation of our interview, and that was one of the components that was mentioned in an article about creating characters. You want your character to have some flaws. You don't want your character to be perfect, because you want that person to be relatable.
Yes, relatable. Definitely important.
Yeah. And I think it's a really interesting feature of character creation, because I think so many of us look at ourselves and wish, I wish I was perfect. I wish I didn't have any of these challenges. I wish it all just came so easily. And yet, from what I'm gleaning from my limited exposure to the world of writing screenplays, is that the flaws in the characters are what make those characters relatable. It's what makes them interesting. What makes a story more interesting. And the obstacles and the challenges that are put in the way of the person are also what make the story more interesting.
Right.
And are the mechanism through which the characters actually go about changing, right? Without that obstacle pushing against them, or them pushing against that obstacle, there would be no transformation. There would be no reason for a person in Act 1 to need to undergo any changes in order to become who we want them to be, or who they become, who we see them to be or grow into in that Act 3.
Yes. And just to sort of continue on, the comedy and tragedy that we were talking about, when you think about it, also in screenwriting, what's very popular is the sequel. So just because the first film about whatever doesn't end well, doesn't mean that there can't be a sequel. So
absolutely, that is such a great point. That is such a great point.
They're really popular sequels.
Well, they're made all the more engaging when you have something to jump back from. Right. And I think that's, there's that lovely expression. I don't know who came up with it, but it's this idea of, you can see yourself as a character in a movie.
Right.
And, if something, this maybe isn't quite a sequel, but if you end your following of that story on a down note, right? Something terrible has happened in Act 1. That person is really down and out. It looks like they're never going to make a comeback. And you stop watching the movie at that point, then you might think that the movie is a tragedy. But if you actually keep watching the movie, then what you'll see is that eventually that person, having hit rock bottom or whatever it is that happened in that first scene, they then make a turnaround and they end up making a comeback and things get so much better. And so you're absolutely right. The same is true with sequels. Just because something doesn't go the way that you want it to, that it ends in a so-called tragedy, doesn't mean that you can't set yourself up for the next phase, the next screenplay, the next iteration of the series where things turn around.
Right.
So we had a conversation. I don't know if you're going to remember this conversation. It was a while back. And we were talking about obstacles and how you get to pick the obstacle that your character gets to encounter. Does this ring any bells?
Did we talk about the types?
I'm totally putting you on the spot. This is a telephone conversation we had probably 2 years ago. I'll jog your memory a little bit. The idea that you want to craft the obstacle for that specific character, as it being something that would be almost like uniquely an obstacle to that person.
Well, in screenwriting, what they often do is make the obstacle the thing that person is held back by the most. For example, in Arachnophobia, the character really was afraid of spiders. So, of course, the obstacle put in the way was this spider. I forget the details of the story, but I do remember it did involve spiders, and it did involve putting a character who was afraid of spiders right smack dab and, with a bunch of spiders. So you do often if you want to really up the ante for having a character have an obstacle that's really meaningful for them in terms of it's what they fear most. Quite often you will choose something that's really already something that scares them. So that's, yes. So I'm not sure that answers the question.
No, it's a perfect answer. I love the example of a spider for somebody who has arachnophobia. And what I love about it too is that I think for all of us, when we are confronted with obstacles in wherever they show up, whether it's in our career, whether it's in some aspect of our personal life, thinking about that obstacle, and almost as though somebody scripted that for you, right?
Right.
You're the hero in the journey. And someone came along and said, oh, Paula Price, she's afraid of spiders. Let's give her some spiders and see what she does, right?
Yeah.
How can we show, hopefully it's not a tragedy. Hopefully I don't end up somewhere, having been vanquished by the spiders. But if you think about it that way, and you think about the obstacles that present within your life, and look at them as being perfectly designed for you to complete the story arc that you were meant to follow. I think that the idea of a scriptwriter, somebody who's at the helm, who's designing these script, there's something comforting almost in thinking, okay, these obstacles that I'm facing, they're here because this is something that is put on this earth to challenge me in a way that is going to help me grow. And if the challenge was something different, it just wouldn't have that same effect. There wouldn't be the same story. There wouldn't be the same growth. So I just really thought that was a way of looking at obstacles that it's different. And I find it inspiring. I find it takes a sting out of obstacles being quite as challenging as they can be.
And one thing is if you can actually win the challenge over an obstacle that's really a big obstacle for you, it somehow gives you confidence that you can think to yourself, well, I overcame this really big thing in my life. Then the smaller things seem easier. Whereas if it's just a small obstacle that you've managed to overcome, you think to yourself, well, okay, maybe I did it with a small obstacle, but I'm still not capable of handling the big obstacle.
Absolutely.
So I think in a way it does build confidence to know that you've gone against the worst fear that you've got. What is it? And you overcame it. Good for you. You can do anything now.
Absolutely. I think that's such a great point. And I love it because I think it's true. First of all, the bigger obstacles are the ones that really test you and allow you to build that confidence. And I think sometimes when we are faced with big obstacles or big projects, and I had a conversation with a lawyer earlier today about something similar, right? Growing a practice and how sometimes we just want things to happen more quickly than they do.
Right.
And there's a tension there because I think if it were to come easily, then there wouldn't be that same level of exercise, right? You wouldn't be applying yourself. You wouldn't be challenging yourself. You wouldn't be learning. And so if the result were handed to you, if it was given to you without the obstacle in the place of it, you wouldn't be the same person as you would be if you had to overcome, the fear of spiders, whatever that would be for you. If you have to overcome that in order to achieve the goal, you're just a different person on the other side of it. And so I think there's so much value to that challenge, whether it's how long something takes, whether it's how difficult something is, that you are a different person on the other side of it. And you have to ask yourself, if you had the thing at the very beginning, what would be different versus if you have it at the end? And often I think you're better off having it after the challenge or after the time has gone by. I have another question for you about obstacles and character development. And in my research, one of the things that I came across is this concept of there being almost like two problems. If you're looking at a single character, they've got a conflict ahead of them. It's like the problem has two different layers to it. There's the internal challenge and then there's the external challenge. And I saw it also referred to as a want or a need, or also story A versus story B. And I'd love for you to explain what that concept is and how it plays out in screenwriting.
Well, I think that one of the best examples of that was probably the story of Rocky, or the picture show Rocky, because what we saw that Rocky go through, quite a bit of the story was devoted to the idea that he wanted to win the fight. That was his strong want. But at the very end of the story, you realize that, well, the end of the story, he's with his girlfriend, and his girlfriend is really proud of him because he won the fight. So he wanted to win the fight, but what he really needed, the basis of that was his need to be accepted emotionally, to be loved. And so his need was to be loved. And his want for that particular situation was to win the fight. But if you look at the difference between wants and needs, wants are very specific. You set up a certain thing that you want, and you think you have to have it. But then if you think of it, you kind of peel it back and say, well, what does this want represent? Well, if the want actually represents love or acceptance, there's different ways to get that. You don't have to necessarily win a boxing match to get that. There's another way to satisfy that need. And needs are tied to our basic emotional human needs, our basic needs. So they, in a sense, are the bigger things to be thinking about than the wants. Like, for example, when we're young, like young girls, 10 years old, we all want a pony. Why do we want a pony? Gee, that would be great. We'd have a connection with, we were looking maybe for connection, fun. But then when you get to my age, honestly, the last thing I'd want right now is a pony. I don't want a pony now. But do I want a connection? Yes. And do I want fun? Yes. There's different things that are still, they go with that idea of having a pony, but I don't necessarily have to have a pony to satisfy those needs.
It's such a funny example. And it's true. And I think what's so interesting about that dual aspect of the character development is that for so many of us, we can see the want, right? The want is pretty clear to us. We want, the job, we want the kids, we want the friends, we want the house, there's these very clear, objective criteria, the equivalent of the pony. And yet when you do that peeling back of the layers, then you see what's really driving it. Maybe it's security, stability, love, connection. It's almost like there's this deeper desire or this need that lies beneath it. And what I love about that duality in the context of screenwriting is that it's a reflection of what's really happening for each of us in our daily lives. And that's one of the privileges I have of working with the lawyers that I work with, again, in the capacity as a coach, is that if you come to me and what you're looking for is to grow your practice or to have better time management or to have better work-life balance, these are all articulated effectively as wants. And yet when you start to do the work, right, when you're presented with the conflict, and the conflict is a challenging one, and it's almost like, that challenge was designed for you. If it's balancing your life, it's like that is for you because there's something there. There's something deeper than that surface level. What does it look like on the outside? And so when you can get to the need, when you can get to what is underneath, that is where that real transformation happens, at least as far as I've seen in the real world. And so I love that in the screenplay writing world, it's basically taking what's happening already, but giving it a structure, giving it a narrative. And I think for each of us, we can actually do that work ourselves. We can look at, for example, some of the obstacles that we have in our lives and look at what we want. What do we really want in relation to that obstacle, whether it's better balance, whether it's a better managed practice, and say to ourselves, okay, like, what is that a reflection of? If it's, the pony example, is it that I want more fun? Is it that I want greater connection? Is it something else? And so you can ask yourself, if it's balance, what is it that I want about balance? What's missing here? And that can help you find out what that need is. And when you fix the need, then sometimes the wants change, right? You, at this stage of your life, maybe you have the connection you need. Maybe it isn't fun to go and have a pony, but you can see how the way that you shift as a person will impact your wants and your needs. So I just love that way of looking at the wants and needs as having these two different layers to the story. Taking a step back, we've been talking a bit about character, we've been talking about conflict, the elements of a story. One of the things that I find fascinating about your screenwriting is the approach that you take to your actual scripting of. And you've told me a few times that there's these different approaches and you tend to prefer one of them. So can you tell us what the different approaches are to screenwriting and what you've chosen and why?
Well, there are coaches in screenwriting as well. There's quite a few very good coaches out there, and they divide it. And this is, again, everything I say is very loosely speaking. and there's definitely experts out there who know far more than I do. But generally speaking, they talk about there's two kinds of writers. There's the planners, and then there's the pantsters. And the planners are very good about planning. They do outlines, and they're very organized before they ever start their stories or their screenplays. And then there's the pantsters, and they just sort of pick up their pencil or go to their computer, whatever, and they just start writing the story. They just dive in and do what's called putting words on the page right away without too much planning. And I tend to be, and I know that there's a lot of coaches out there who do not like this idea, but I have to admit, bottom line, I am a pantster. I like to just dive in there and write. And this is a very rude expression, so excuse me, but they call it the vomit script. And that's the way you blurt it all out onto the page. There it goes, splat, splat, splat. It's not great. And then the type of person that would write this kind of script, they don't leave it like that. They clean it up, just
like you clean up the vomit.
They reshape it. They do go back, but they have a need to just get everything out there to begin with, and then go back and trim it down or you change things around and work with the script and change and get it so it's much better. But it's those two very different approaches. And I think there's people who feel, I think quite strongly actually, because I read different biographies of different screenwriters, and some would feel very uncomfortable doing it one way, and there's another group that don't want to do it the other way. So I think there's very much these two types of writers out there in general.
I love this. And so when you are, okay, so you've done the script, you've vomited or you're vomiting. And we've had conversations about this, and I find it so fascinating. How is it that you decide what is going to happen next? So you're in the middle of it, you're writing it, you don't have a plan. How do you decide what happens next in the story?
That's why I can't be a planner, because I have to see it in my imagination. And I sort of shut my eyes and really I let go. And the characters just do these things themselves. And they say these things. And I'm more of a scribe to what's going on in my imagination than someone who's telling, putting words into the character's mouth, so to speak, or putting them in certain scenes. It all just happens somewhere out there in the sky or whatever, where you imagine your imagination to be, and watch it and write it down. And that's why it's very hard for me to be a planner, because until I write the story, I don't know what the story is. I have no idea. It'd be like asking a film reviewer to write a review of a film they've never seen to me. That's what being asked to write a plan or a script would be. Because I don't know what the plan is, because I haven't seen the story. I haven't seen the film.
I love this so much. I love this so much because it addresses a tension that I see quite a bit, which is the tension between wanting to plan everything and have everything be scripted and make a decision that is the right decision. There's certainty, whether it's taking a new job, whether it's an action on a file where, on the one hand, it's like we're attached to the script, especially lawyers, right? Lawyers who've gone through law school and the training, and there's this kind of lockstep. There's a way things are done, and there's a right way to do it, and here's how you do it, versus what you've described, right? The pantster, flying by the seat of your pants. And I love how you've made that confession here on the podcast. Pamela Price is a pantster. We now all have this declaration. But what I love about it is that you've got the story. So the story goes out, you've put out the first draft, but the way that the story unfolds is what I find so fascinating, because what you're saying is that there's a human being, a fictitious one, but nonetheless a character, a person. And that person doesn't know what they're going to say, what they're going to do, how they're going to feel in a particular situation until they're actually in it. And that sounds like the point where you're drawing on your imagination. You're thinking, what would a real human being do in this situation? And then the actions flow from there. And what I love thinking about is how, yes, we can lay plans. And I think it's important to have some element of structure in our lives, our real lives, where we've got bills to pay and perhaps children to look after and, professional goals or whatever it is. So yes, we want to have a certain level of planning. And yet, if we try to hold on too tight, some of us will have the plans and execute on the plans. As you've mentioned, there are people who will write script like that. No problem. But for others, there's a need to be in the moment. There's a need to kind of take things as they go. And there's value in that. There's value in knowing, okay, if I try this and it doesn't work for me, that's okay. I can do the next thing. Or if I'm in a conversation with this type of person, this is how it's going to unfold. And so what I see as so beautiful is that you can have these two different approaches, and maybe you lean naturally more towards a pantster versus a planner. And maybe vice versa. It's almost like you can take elements of either approach and use that as you're building out your own story, right? If your own story is your life, it's your career, and you think, okay, well, I should have it all scripted because someone told me that I need to have everything written out from now until, retirement, versus giving yourself that luxury of being able to go down and try certain things, right? Go take a detour, see if it works for you. And if it doesn't, you can always come back. So that just really resonated to me in terms of, or I guess it resonated with me in terms of the ways that we can approach the decisions in our lives. They don't have to be perfectly scripted. They could be perfectly scripted, but there's this magic, there's this imagination that is in between. And if we allow ourselves to go there, then what you can create with that has so much more texture potentially. And it may not be something that you ever could have conceived of if you were simply following the original plan. So I think it's such a neat way. Now, I guess I need to have another podcast episode with a planner. So they can come on and they can defend the plan. They can tell me why the plan. But personally, I like the pantster idea. Just a couple more questions. And the first question, the first of those is, so you're writing these stories, and I just love that, you're receiving these awards, all this recognition, the screenplays, the music videos, all of it. It's super, super fun. When you're writing a story, what is it that you think makes for a compelling narrative?
Well, I guess I like to see a story where the person does struggle. And I like to see them overcome that story, that feel-good feeling that you get at the end and say, oh, that was so great. And you sort of go with you end up being very happy because something has turned out well for somebody who's really tried. So I think that's what I like in the story, sort of a personal achievement at the end that was hard fought for. I like to see that. And I guess that would be my favorite kind of story.
And how do you create that when you're in the middle of a screenplay writing session? How do you do that? How do you decide what the struggle is going to be? How do you have that character evolve?
Well, I think you start with the character and you think, okay, what flaw or difficulty are you going to give to that character? For example, I wrote a thriller. It's called Yummy. It's a TV pilot, an hour-long TV pilot. So because I worked with students with learning disabilities, I gave that character the problem that she had difficulty learning how to read. So this was what she started out with. And she's in a terrible situation right now in the first hour-long episode. And we're going to see her learn how to cope with that disability in the area of reading and see her life improve as she goes along, because she really has to work hard to succeed. And she's going to go through all sorts of things. But hopefully at the end, there's going to be the happy ending for her. And so that's the kind of story I like to see. I like to see something where there is a struggle and they succeed at the end. So I guess that's why.
No, and I love that. And so using her as an example, what are some of if we look at the stories about the transitions, right? If we look at, okay, the external challenge is, she can't read very well. She wants to do something that presumably requires her to be a reasonably competent writer. So if her first level overcoming the obstacle were being able to read, what do you think has to happen for her in order that sort of second level? What has to happen for her to become that person?
Well, in this story, she actually, as an adult, goes to an adult learning class in terms of, and I think there should be more of these. I wrote this partly, because of my education background. It would be great to see more of these classes for adult learners who are, as adults, not doing as well as they could in their careers just because they do have this disability in the area of reading, and it is an invisible one. People would look at them, they wouldn't know that they were struggling with that, and yet it does hold people back from doing as well as they can at the university level. So in this story, actually, she's the younger sibling of, I haven't told you about this, but her older sister is a lawyer and very successful. And she's a YouTuber. I got a YouTube channel, so she's quite creative, but she's not really doing as well as she could in her career because of this difficulty with reading. She wants to go to university, better herself, get a degree in something at university that'll allow her to have a better job in the long run. So she goes to an adult learning class. and they're where they specialize in teaching adults how to read. So that's her journey through that. But many things happen with it. Take her off course.
So interesting. So we must stay tuned. And what was the title of that one?
It was called Yummy.
Yummy.
And yes, because part of her YouTube channel has to do with ice cream. Which, as we all know, is yummy.
It is very yummy.
Especially when it has a cherry on top.
It is yummy. I love it. I love it. Thank you so much. And thank you so much. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would like to share about screenplay writing that you think is important or that we've not really covered?
Just that if you do want to try it, I would say just jump in with 2 feet and try it. If it's something you'd like to do in your spare time.
This is the jump in approach.
Very addictive. Warning.
Warning, it is addictive. I love it. It's so good. Thank you so much, Mom, for coming on today's podcast. It's been so much fun having you here. It's been a real pleasure. It's a very fine moment. Thank you. And for all your support along all of these episodes. And we will have the pleasure of being able to go and celebrate when this episode goes live next week. We're recording a week early, so we'll have a chance to celebrate. And I just wanted to thank you for sharing everything that you shared about screenplay writing, because I do think it's really impactful for each of us to think about how we are scripting within our own lives and how we can use some of these elements to be creative and to create the stories for ourselves that we really want to play out. Now, for anybody who is interested in finding you, learning more about the work that you're doing, where's a good place to reach you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, and the words to go on my LinkedIn profile are Pam Price, screenwriter, songwriter, animator at Pam Price Productions. So my production company is basically me. It's not as impressive as it sounds, but nevertheless.
It's lovely. And we will have a link to that in the notes that go along with the episode. So for anybody who wants to reach out and learn more about Pam Price and her amazing screenplays and songwriting, all of it, please go and find her there. And you shared a fun fact with me just a few minutes ago. Turns out you're also on TikTok.
Yes, and your
turns out we're both on TikTok.
Yes, well, we'll leave it at that then. And Stephen is singing.
Yes, brother Steve is singing as well. So for any of you who are looking for things to do, you can find us on TikTok. I'm not quite sure where we are or what we're doing, but there's that as well.
So if you go on TikTok, which I just found out today, first of all, you have to Google this. Google Pam Price Blue Tattoo, which will lead you to the TikTok song, my song Blue Tattoo, sung by Paula's brother and my son, Stephen Price, with, unbelievably, and I'd forgotten this, Paula's artwork as the cover artwork for the song.
This is a highly creative endeavor. So if you're looking for things to find on TikTok. So thank you, everybody, for joining me here this week with my amazing mother. And it has been such a pleasure having you, Mom, and such a pleasure to everybody joining. And we will look forward to another episode next week. So thank you, and bye for now.
Thank you, Paula. Really fun. Thanks. Bye for now.
If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.